I wasn't joking when I said I'm going to make websites and web hosting a lot more fun than what you're used to. So traditionally, if you were the architect of a global e-commerce store, you would probably make a recommendation to put, web servers around the globe so that your users are accessing the closest web server in order to get the best response time. Well, Amazon has come up with this idea of leveraging its global infrastructure, its presence around the world to deliver content. And that's what CloudFront is for. So CloudFront, in essence, is a global content delivery network. Now, we've talked in earlier modules about the fact that there are edge locations in the global infrastructure, in the Amazon global infrastructure. And these edge locations tend to serve specific purposes. Route 53 or the DNS is one of them. Well, guess what? CloudFront is the other face of that global infrastructure leveraged by those edge locations. What you do essentially is if you have a website, and this website, by the way, does not necessarily have to be hosted on AWS. It doesn't have to be an EC2 instance or an S3 static pages or anything like that. But you can create a CloudFront distribution, point it to your website, and that will automatically generate a long URL, create a DNS host name or alias that points back to that long URL, and voila, you have now leveraged the entire global infrastructure of AWS. Okay, I went a little too quickly on that, but what this means is, let's go through some of the definitions. But what this essentially means is that you're leveraging all of the AWS edge locations. Well, leveraging them how? Well, you're caching static content. So everywhere AWS has an edge location, and let's say that your website, just for conversation purposes, hosts static content, which means content that does not change frequently. Well, every time this content is requested by a certain geographical area, it will be downloaded and stored in cache on these edge locations. So everybody in that geographical area will now be able to access this content. Think of it very similarly to a WAN accelerator. A WAN accelerator, once you've deployed, will also cache information so that it's not requesting this information frequently from the central location. So think of this, but on a global level, right? Where you have hundreds of these WAN accelerators all over the world that are dedicated to caching this content. Now, this is not a WAN accelerator. I'm just giving you an example of how they're leveraging this. So they have all of these edge locations that support S3 from a DNS perspective, but they're also able to cache your static content for your websites. But you're probably thinking, hey, Eli, my content is not static. I have a dynamic site, pages changes frequently, etc., which is, the case with a lot of other websites these days. Well, for dynamic information, what it does is it proxies the information. So instead of pointing all of the traffic towards your website, and your web servers are still going to have to do a lot of things other than present content, the edge locations are able to offload certain tasks so they're not putting a lot of pressure on the actual server, which will increase your response time. So it's accelerating that traffic by caching it when possible and delivering it locally to those users. It's leveraging the global infrastructure presence of all of these edge locations that Amazon has spread all across the world, and it's proxying dynamic information. It's a really great thing. It works with AWS and non-AWS services. So again, you don't have to host your website on S3 or in an EC2 instance. You can have it wherever it is today. And the configuration of this is really, really easy. It's just difficult to kind of demo. But what you would have to do is, if you have an existing website that you want to use CloudFront for, you go into CloudFront from the AWS Management Console, you create a distribution, and that distribution will ask you for a bunch of information. Actually, let's go through, I'll take you as far as I can from a demo perspective. So from the Management Console, we're going to click on CloudFront, and it's going to bring you to this point, right? So here you're going to go ahead and click on Create a Distribution. And whether you're doing it for web or you're doing it for RTMP, whatever the case is, for us, it's going to be for web. So you're going to create this, and you're going to go in and you're going to fill out all of the information. So the origin domain name, the path, the ID, etc. You're going to fill in all of this information that it asks you for. Now, if I was to boil down all of this information and kind of summarize it so that it's digestible, what you're doing here is you're creating a link, an integration point between your current website and AWS CloudFront. That's what's known as a distribution. Once you've filled out all the information in this form and you click on the Create button, what it's going to do is it's going to generate a URL. This URL essentially will now be what your users are going to point to in order for them to get access to this global infrastructure. So once the distribution is created, AWS will then start to spread the content, the static content where it can, and cache it, and it will use proxying for the dynamic content. Now, you are probably saying, well, I don't want to use this URL that AWS has generated. That's where DNS comes into play. You can go into your DNS, create a CNAME with your www.mydomainname.com that points to this URL that AWS just created. And as far as your users are concerned, it's a seamless experience. They don't know that they're accessing a CloudFormation distribution. It's honestly a beautiful thing. CloudFormation. This brings us to CloudFormation. This particular service I've dealt with quite a bit because it's really cool. And if you're like me, I love automation. I love to be able to be as lazy as possible. And if there's someone that will do most of the work for me, hey, I'm going to leverage it to the death. And I'm going to tell you a story about how I use CloudFormation to deploy Citrix XenApp environment on the AWS cloud. But let's go first through the definition. So CloudFormation essentially automates AWS resource provisioning, which means if you're trying to deploy a system of sorts on AWS, and for conversation's sake, because I brought up Citrix XenApp, let's talk about that. So Citrix XenApp has a bunch of requirements that you need in order to deploy on the AWS cloud, right? You need your XenApp farm that requires a database server. You're going to need a bunch of XenApp servers, etc. It has a bunch of prerequisites that need to be brought up. And then once you've brought them up, you have to be able to integrate them. The XenApp servers have to point to the database server and so on and so forth. So you have to integrate all of this together. And then if you want to deploy, for example, a NetScaler or an access gateway in front of that so that your users are able to proxy in via SSL from the outside, then you have to deploy a NetScaler instance and also configure that to talk to your XenApp farm. There are just a lot of different components that tie into this environment. You could do it manually, and for the most part, we've been doing it manually for the longest time, and that will take you, a couple of hours, days, whatever it needs in order for you to get all of this right. Well, what if you can use something like CloudFormation, where it's essentially scripted? You deploy a file. I'm going to show that to you in a second. It'll prompt you for a set of parameters, the IP addresses, the names of the instances, etc. And once you've filled out that form, it will deploy the entire environment for you. I am talking soup to nuts. You'll have your database, you'll have your XenApp servers, your NetScaler, the whole thing deployed in a half an hour or less. Now, to me, that would be a really cool proposition, and that's essentially what CloudFormation offers you, is the automation of AWS resource provisioning. Now, you can create your own CloudFormation so that, let's say, maybe you work for an organization that requires the deployment of a web server, an application server, and a database server on a frequent basis because you're dealing with a lot of developers. Well, you can create your own CloudFormation. That way you're constantly redeploying that same template that deploys more than one instance and integrates them together and does all of that automation. So you're able to create it yourself, or you're able to download it from someone else that's created one already that ties into the right AWS resources. And we'll talk about that because I have downloaded one that I want to show you how it works to some extent. We won't be able to go through the whole thing, but you'll get the idea. It's a free service, so using CloudFormation isn't going to cost you anything. And again, there's really no gotcha here. The idea is if you're leveraging CloudFormation, you're going to be provisioning EC2 instances and S3 storage, etc. So you're going to be using a lot of the other services that AWS will be able to charge you for. As a result, it gives it away for free. The other cool thing about CloudFormation is because you're deploying an entire environment, you're not deploying specifically one instance and that's it. You're going to be leveraging several different types of services within AWS. If at one point you want to delete this environment, what it does for you is it cleans up. So it'll delete everything that was deployed, all of the instances, all of the services that were deployed except data. So if you have data that's stored somewhere, it will steer free or steer away from the data so that it's not touching that because data tends to be sensitive. But everything else it deletes for you. That way you're not getting billed for it. Now let me show you how a CloudFormation works. We're gonna go as far as we can go, but you're gonna kind of get the idea. I think you're getting a feel for how it works. Let's jump into our presentation real quick. So over here under deployment and management, we're gonna click on CloudFormation. And what this brings up is the ability for you to create a stack, or you can create a template from your existing resources. So again, If you have existing resources that are spread out there and you want to kind of tie them together, you can do that as well. For the purposes of this demonstration, we're going to go ahead and click on Create a Stack. We're going to give this a name. So since we started off with XenApp, let's stick with XenApp. And what I've done is I've already downloaded a CloudFormation. So I want to use an existing file in order to start the process of deploying this new XenApp farm that I have. So what I want to do here is I'm going to go ahead and click on Choose a File. And then I've downloaded this file into my Downloads folder. So I'm going to go ahead and select it. Once you click on Open, you've given it a name, etc. It's loaded up here. We're going to go ahead and click on Next. And that essentially kickstarts all the information that this CloudFormation needs in order to deploy your environment properly. So for example, it's asking for your Active Directory private IP address. What do you want the IP address for your Active Directory to be? Now again, you would have to select an IP address that matches the subnet scheme that you have in your virtual private cloud, right? So as you've gone through and you've configured your virtual private cloud and you've configured all of your subnets and you know what's internal and what's external, you'll be able to do that here. You'll be able to add another Active Directory for private IP address for your second Active Directory server if you need to. And these are useful, especially if you're deploying across multiple availability zones. So this one will be in availability zone 1. This one will be in availability zone 2. And this is what brings up the availability zones. So here's where you can choose which availability zones you want to deploy this environment in. And again, based on this, you'll be able to select the right IP address scheme up here. So you get the idea of, all the information that this particular script requires in order for it to begin the process of installing and configuring and deploying your environment. Once you have all of the networking and you click on Next, and it'll ask you a bunch of other questions, finally you get to a point where it's ready to deploy, and it'll go through and it'll deploy all the right instances. It will deploy all of the right services that are tied to it. For example, here you see Active Directory in multiple availability zones. And no kidding, in less than a half an hour, bada bing, bada boom, you have a Citrix XenApp environment that's deployed and ready for use. That's the power of CloudFormation. That's that's some of the automation that you get. And by the way, if you're wondering, well, where is it getting all these resources? So it's leveraging AMIs. So for example, from an Active Directory perspective, it's going to be calling an Active Directory AMI that might be available in the Amazon Marketplace that this particular CloudFormation has tested against. So this CloudFormation is a bunch of scripts back-end that are tying to AMIs and a bunch of other configurations to deploy the environment. So they've tested an Active Directory image, they've tested a NetScaler image, they have a Citrix XenApp image up there that they're also referencing and calling. So all of these back-end tie-ins to these, call them virtual machine templates or AMIs, whichever makes it easier for you to understand, and it's deploying them, then it's integrating them, configuring them, and bringing the environment up for you to add your final touches on it before you can use it. It's really cool stuff. Now with Elastic Beanstalk, it's very similar to CloudFormation. As a matter of fact, Elastic Beanstalk leverages CloudFormation. However, the differentiator is Elastic Beanstalk is more geared for developers. What it does is if you're a developer that's created an application, but you don't know a lot about infrastructure, you don't know how to deploy instances, you don't know how to create auto-scaling groups, you don't know all of that. It's created sort of, we can call them profiles for the different languages that you've created your application in that will aid you in the deployment process. So if you go in and say, I want to deploy something for IIS, it will go through and provision the right instances, the right services that you need for an IIS type application. Now the way that it's doing this type of provisioning is it's doing it leveraging CloudFormation templates, right? So if you're saying IIS, then it's probably calling on a CloudFormation template by IIS to deploy all of the right Amazon AWS instances required for this particular application to run properly. Now you're probably wondering, well, if it's doing that, well, why does it warrant a service on its own? Well, because it gives developers a lot more control over what services to deploy within that CloudFormation. So it's not just deploy the template and kind of back off. It gives them control over what to deploy, how much to deploy. So there's a lot of integration and capabilities there as far as what they can and cannot do, but it's geared a lot more towards developers. And the way to access that through the management console is under deployment and management. Here you'll see Elastic Beanstalk, and you can go in here and again You can select essentially what you're trying to deploy. So for instance, if you're trying to deploy something with IIS, you would select that and launch now, and it would take you again through a series of things that you would have to configure and select in order for it to deploy a default environment built around IIS. So again, it will, you'll start to see what it's doing in the backend, like provisioning EC2 instances or creating S3 buckets. All of the stuff that you would have to do manually, it will now be provisioning for you on the fly in the background. So as you can see, this was very easy, very quick for me to begin that deployment of this particular environment. And it'll take a little bit of time, but you'll start to see here what it's doing and what it's completing from a tasks perspective, so you can continue to monitor it. But you can see the power of what you get with these types of services. Now, the idea here is, while I very quickly was able to deploy this environment and it's taking time to provision all of these instances and all of these services in the background, I can just as easily discontinue or delete this particular Beanstalk when I'm ready, and it'll go through and it will delete everything that it is currently creating as well, so that it kind of cleans up and I'm not getting billed for all of this stuff in the background. So it's a very helpful, very handy tool to use here. Now, the last service that I want to talk about here is called CloudTrail. CloudTrail is one of my favorite services because I like auditing and security, and I want to make sure that I have visibility over what's going on in my environment, especially when I'm using things like cloud, right? So with CloudTrail, that's a particular service that gives you those capabilities. So it records all API calls that happen in your account. Now, when I say all, I mean everything, right? So the identity of the API caller, which caller, who did this API call, the time the API call was made, the source IP address of the API call, what are the parameters that this API call requested, right? What were the response elements that were returned? So what did the API return as far as response elements? What did it give back to that user or to that requester? So very powerful information that it logs for you here. And it maintains a history also. And it maintains a history of the API calls that were made through the management console, through any kind of SDKs, through the command line tools, and through other AWS services. For example, anyone? We just talked about them. Right, CloudFormation, right? CloudFormation is one that it would keep a log of that, or Elastic Beanstalk. These are types of services that it would maintain a history for who's called upon these APIs. If I was on the receiving end of this module, my blood would be boiling at this point. I'd want to just jump into AWS and start creating stuff, or I'd want to go out there and start finding clients or customers that I can architect environments over AWS, because some of this stuff is really, really, frankly, very cool. And as you start to work with it more, you'll start to have an even more appreciation, not just for the service itself, but for the effort that was put in making it so simple and automating it and bringing it down to a level that we can consume it so easily. So what did we cover in this module? We started off by talking about CloudFront. CloudFront is a content delivery network that leverages all of the AWS edge locations to cache static content or to proxy dynamic content. It's a very effective way of delivering your content worldwide, leveraging the global infrastructure from AWS. We then talked about CloudFormation. CloudFormation is a way by which you can automate the provisioning of an entire environment. You're able to script things in a very easy way. CloudFormation allows you to do that, and I showed you the example of how you can begin deploying a XenApp farm within your AWS cloud by downloading the proper scripts from Citrix or whoever else has written them, and then leveraging CloudFormation to deploy that entire environment. We also talked about Elastic Beanstalk and the fact that Elastic Beanstalk is more geared towards developers that are writing their code but don't really have an idea of what is the required infrastructure to deploy. Elastic Beanstalk leverages CloudFormation. It has profiles for IIS, for PHP and others, where it will deploy an environment for you and allow you to have that application work there. It will also give you a lot more control over what gets deployed and how the integration happens. And finally, we talked about CloudTrail. CloudTrail is a way of keeping an audit of all the API calls that are happening within your account. You're able to log things from your management console, from SDKs, from your command line, other tools like CloudFormation. And it maintains a history of who called upon the API, the time, what were the resources requested, what was the response as far as what the API caller received from a resources perspective. So it gives you a good idea of what's going on within your environment. Finally, I hope this module was very informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.